We've seen massacres like the Red Wedding, the fall of King's Landing, but nothing like this. Like you, I used to love Game of Thrones, the worldwide phenomenon that had something for everyone, that spouted complex themes out the wazoo and put characters and moral paradoxes hitherto unseen in popular media. Grounded world building that made all this fantasy jargon feel real and lived in, with endlessly quotable dialogue and fun battles with legitimate stake, because everything tied back to the characters and their development. Subverting tropes without the conscious feeling that it's just for the sake of subversion that these events actually meant something. At its peak, we were strapped in, and the only thing on my mind was that I had no idea where all these threads were leading. Some, sure, but I had no general sense of the bigger picture. There were more rootable and more hateable characters, but there was no real sense of good or bad. No one knew where exactly it was heading, or really does, because the real ending has yet to be written and published into existence, but we were all strapped in for the ride. It makes sense then, that with only cliff notes and spitballs from George R.R. Martin to work with, the show spiraled out of control. At the start of this channel, I did a little video essay about the show, but I've since shifted into a different kind of format, so I've been waiting to talk about Game of Thrones again. I've been looking forward to doing fun stuff like listing my top 5 episodes or ranking the seasons. I think the first 4 seasons each progressively improved, to the point where seasons 3 and 4 are some of the best television ever produced, and while there's much debate, I think season 4 is easily the best, even though season 3 has the best episode and the best music. All the characters were the best versions of themselves this season, and it all threaded into a coherent, singular feeling story that wrapped up most of what the show had been working towards and planting exciting seeds for what would happen in the future. There's a notion that it was as soon as the show ran out of source material that it started to fall apart, but I think the cracks begin to show as early as season 5 when they still had a book to work with. And I think this is because the show had deviated so much from the source material, it might as well have not had source material at all at that point. So I guess there's some merit to that notion. It's interesting to note then that this is the first season that won the Emmy for Best Drama, mostly because it was the first season that didn't have to compete with Breaking Bad. But I see this season 5 award as more of an honorary award for the first 4 seasons. I honestly think season 6 is pretty great despite the lack of source material, but it's clear in the dialogue and the more Hollywood-style storytelling that this was becoming a very different show. Season 7 was when it really started to shit the bed, ignoring the pre-established geographic laws that made the show feel so grounded in the first place. Most of the interesting conflict in the show happened because of the detours, and on one hand, I understand abandoning this goal because they're wrapping stuff up, and introducing new conflict is counterproductive to that goal. But on the other hand, there's a way to wrap stuff up organically that doesn't involve contradicting its own logic. I could blame the showrunner's insistence on doing 15 episodes for the last 2 seasons, even though the producers were willing to give them as many episodes as they wanted, but the show had already lost so much of its flavor that I'm not sure I'd even want more episodes than we got. Characters kind of just say things that need to be said, and everyone feels more homogenized because the writers lost their individual sense of character, which leads me to believe they never really had it in the first place, and by sticking to the work of someone who did, they were able to coast by. This season had all those same flaws and just amplified them, sprinting to the finish that led it to fizzle out. So let's talk about season 8, or as I like to call it, there was a lot of intrigue going into this season. Information like the 2 years it took to film, the fact that it was only 6 episodes, and the fact that most of those episodes were closer to the length of a short feature film rather than a TV episode. But I think this all led to some really bizarre pacing. On one hand, I hated that we got 2 full episodes of just preparation. But on the other hand, I feel like what happened in those episodes was rushed. Maybe it's the fact that even though there's a lot to cram in, the writers take breaks and include a scene where Jon and Daenerys go on a date. Writing this review, I almost gave it props for establishing the awkwardness between Jon and Daenerys with the information that he's Aegon Targaryen, but then I remembered that neither of them know that in this scene. Sure, there's a callback to the cave, but the whole scene feels like a long, empty placeholder that doesn't establish anything new about their relationship and takes time away from more important character moments that are then consequently rushed. This dynamic takes up a third of the season. And then we get episodes like The Last of the Starks, which has no sense of momentum whatsoever with its disjointed acts. I'm not suggesting they break these into 2 different episodes and make them longer than they already are, but it feels like the fact that they're the same episode is more of an arbitrary decision to keep everything within the time frame of 6 episodes. There's nothing that makes this episode feel like a cogent chapter. This is even true of the finale. In traditional Game of Thrones fashion, the climax always came in the penultimate episode, and the final episode is the resolution, more or less. This might have seemed frustrating on a week-to-week basis, but binging each season as a self-contained story, this pacing was perfect. When you only have 6 episodes to work with, though, you have to combine both of those into the same episode, and it feels, once again, like 2 different episodes with a jarring time skip in the middle. The only episode that felt like one rightful episode was the Battle of Winterfell. The rest of the season had no reason to be broken up the way it was. Endgame and the Battle of Winterfell came out the same weekend, and I remember even though I like the final battle in Endgame for the most part, it was very much a relief to watch this episode and see a lot more practical stuff. So it annoys me when people complain about the show striving for realism. Yes, this is a show about dragons and ice zombies, but that's exactly why it has to strive for realism, and that's why I appreciate when it does, and that's why I hate when it doesn't. The show lost its sense of geography last season, so I won't complain about Jaime making it to King's Landing overnight. There are more important things to worry about. Like the fact that we're supposed to buy that the whole show has revolved around Daenerys gathering the most competent minds in the discovered world, yet they let her forget about the Iron Fleet and fly right into battle, losing one of her dragons. We're supposed to believe that with point-blank accuracy they can take out the dragon she's not on but miss her. We're supposed to believe that after this close encounter, her game plan is to just fly directly towards them again and hope that they miss, and that it works. Stuff like Euron Greyjoy jumping out at the right moment, albeit engulfed in flame, and swimming all the way to the exact spot Jaime winds up? Call it nitpicky, but this is the whole reason Jaime's crippled at the end. The counter-argument to this would be to say Euron's wounds aren't what crippled him and that he would have died anyway, and I may agree with that, but then that line of thinking would support that this entire face-off is inconsequential. Look, Euron is just a terribly designed, terribly executed character. But I'm getting off track here. Jon and Daenerys have no chemistry, and belief in their love is what's supposed to sell us on Jon's loyalty to her. This loyalty being the reason King's Landing burned down, and the reason this sacrifice is supposed to be such an emotional roller coaster. This is a problem more with the writing than the acting, but pointing fingers here is a little pointless, because it's the final product that matters. We get a good sense of the awkwardness between them with the knowledge that he's her nephew and also the rightful heir, but that's not very effective when things already felt awkward between them. Even the physical believability of the show is diminished a little. We've had some bad green screening and compositing in the past, but this season has had a much higher concentration. The penultimate episode looks like 90% of it was shot by a second unit team, and the fire looks like an After Effects tutorial. Halfway through the episode, the sword sound effects sound all compressed and low-cut. Considering all the extra time and money the show had, I would expect them to at least maintain the same level of technical prowess, but aside from some exceptional spurts of editing here and there, some well-composed, minimal CGI shots, I was let down. And even when the CGI is good, we'll get a ridiculously cartoonish shot like this. I feel like I'm watching Angelina Jolie's Maleficent. And while we're talking about editing, I'm drawn back to this possibly inconsequential fight, because it's like the worst thing I've seen since the fucking Sand Snake fight in Season 5. It's so hard to believe that this is the same director as battles like Battle of the Bastards or Hardhome, because it's actually borderline incompetent. There's no sense of continuity whatsoever, which could be an intentional artistic choice to represent the disorientation of the characters, but it's not jarring enough to really convey that disorientation, and it just looks like a poorly choreographed, poorly edited fight. I hate to end this section on such an inconsequential note, but these issues plague all sorts of moments throughout the past 2 seasons. The characters have been on the downfall for a while now. Polar shifts to good versus bad have become comically clear, and the dialogue is fucking terrible. Again, I suspect that this is because the writers never really had the chops for it in the first place and mostly relied on quotes from the source material, or maybe they're just burnt out and I should give them a little more credit for the earlier seasons, but characters have been dropping left and right, more so in quality than in actual physical depth. Of the few that have remained great characters, I'd say Arya has, Theon has, and Brienne sort of has. Of course, there were things this season that have hindered those characters, namely Brienne assuming the role of a housewife after the Battle of Winterfell and not going to King's Landing for the battle, her final character moment merely serving as a redemption of Jaime rather than anything for herself, as well as Theon dying for no real cause. His arc ended where it should have, fighting for the Starks, and it was great that he protected Bran that whole time, but his very final action didn't serve any real purpose. It didn't slow the White Walkers' progression at all, it didn't stall them for Arya to show up. The Night King basically swatted him down like a fly. That's a little more nitpicky though, far from the Massacre of Theon Greyjoy. But the character who I'd say has remained the most ambiguous and compelling, who's maintained an arc perhaps both in spite of and because of that ambiguity, is Jaime. Or should I say, was Jaime. By episode 4 of this season, I would say he's the best character. Then the show takes all the development they've given him and throws it in the garbage. He's established as a scumbag, then he's redeemed in season 3, we see the good in him, but as good as we think he is, he's still fucking Cersei. In season 7 we get this moment where he finally leaves her, a big moment for his arc. It does make him a little less ambiguous, but considering his relations with the Starks, he's still got a decent amount of complexity, at least more so than most other characters. Then, even though he's known all this time that the plan was to storm King's Landing, he leaves Winterfell and confesses his love for Cersei when there's no catalyst for this change within him. I'm not going to say that the only good thing they could have done with Jaime is have him kill Cersei, even though I would have liked that, but the fact that he goes all this way, suffers so much to get her again, and then they die together in this romantic Nicholas Sparks situation, almost condoning and even rewarding their incest, goes against so much they've set up for him. Even worse, though, is his disregard for the innocent lives. The whole reason he became the Kingslayer, ruining his public image and making endless enemies, was for the sake of this exact public. The fact that in his last moments he contradicts something so crucial to his character is perhaps blatant disrespect for all the work the show has done, and at the very least, just embarrassing ignorance. Cersei used to be a compelling, yet successfully hateable villain, but all she's had to do this season is stand around, drink wine, and talk about elephants. She had no legitimate plan for this invasion aside from relying on the Iron Fleet. I mean, I just feel like this season has made everyone more incompetent, but not for the sake of character. I think it's out of a lack of knowing how to write these complex interactions. And obviously, I can't sit here pretending like I know how to do that. That stuff is difficult, but this is HBO. This is the most popular show on television right now. You'd think they would hire people, the few people in the world, who would know how to do that. I mean, one of Martin's active goals writing the series was to eliminate any sense of superficial Hollywood battling and presenting complex, again, realistic warfare where tactics are worked through, and we benefit from seeing all these factors tied together, where we have the theoretical plan and where in practice things go awry, and we, having been informed of all the factors, can pinpoint this stuff for ourselves. The show still tries that, but it comes off as superficial and lazy. But I'm getting off topic again. I'm talking about Cersei right now. In the past, I've been one to complain about people saying stuff like, this person should have fought this person, or that person should have fought that person. For instance, I'm okay with Arya killing the Night King. But I will say that even though Daenerys is responsible for the rubble, and it's her own city that kills her, it's a little dissatisfying to the direction they've taken her character to have her die off in this romantic, again, potentially rewarding situation. I feel like if she could have chosen a way to die, she would probably choose this, comforted in her lover's arms, dying beside him. But it's not even a complex ending to her character in the sense that she necessarily got what she wanted and won in spite of dying. She still lost, but she lost in a very lukewarm way. And I know that this is because the show is officially deeming Daenerys the villain, but when Cersei has been the overarching villain for so long, it just feels like her ending fizzled out. As for Tyrion, season 4 put him through so much, of course he couldn't be the same character, as great of a character as he was. But ever since season 5, he's had little to do, and what he has done has just been fuck up after fuck up. He's supposed to be archetypically the smart character, and he's just become a bumbling sidekick who hasn't done anything useful in years. He used to be probably the best character in the whole show, and now he's just...
It was a mistake.
But it's not that this is an arc where his fuck-ups help him learn something, he just happens to be wrong a lot. And I can't even spend much time criticizing him because at this point the show's given us so little of him to work with. I will say that if there's one thing the finale fixed, it finally made Tyrion smart again, for the most part. But there's this line where he says he loved Daenerys that's a little confusing. My interpretation was that he loved her like a queen, not a romantic love, but then I was reminded of this scene where he's listening to Jon and Daenerys doing their thing, so I really have no idea what to make of it. I'm just gonna assume for my own sake that he didn't mean romantic love and that this is just an inconsequential scene, because I don't think it's a smart direction to make Tyrion in love with Daenerys. And speaking of... this is the one people are going to be divided on for the course of time, the next Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, and unfortunately this time, I find myself in the position saying she was mishandled. There are characters for whom I wasn't crazy about the direction the show took them in, like Grey Worm being the final villain in a sense, but it's stuff I can't really complain about because I can understand how the character got there, and it's just a matter of personal preference. Then there's Daenerys. Now, the common argument in favor of her turn here is that it's been foreshadowed, and yes, this threat has been very explicitly dangled in front of her for the whole show. She has this vision in season 2 that's directly paralleled in the finale. She does this to the Tarleys. She talks constantly about winning her place with fire and fury and conquering with fear. But first of all, in none of these scenes does she advocate for massacring thousands of innocent civilians, unless maybe she means they might have to be collateral damage, but it's always out of necessity. This is not collateral damage. This is murder. Why does she believe the citizens of all these other tyrannical cities are victims to their government, but the citizens of King's Landing aren't? I think a cause for much of the discrepancy here is the fact that when you have a 70-hour TV show, there's a lot of time for a lot of character moments, and you wind up with so much to work with, technically anything could be argued as foreshadowed. However, there's pretty much always a prevalent path with a more consciously paved route. I used to play a game called Tivits in elementary school. In a nutshell, you have designated dice with numerical values that you want to place on the other side of the map so that the designated operations there with your numbers total to a higher number than your opponent. There's not a right or wrong way of advancing the dice, but there is a way to maximize your score with a certain formation at the end. What Game of Thrones did with Daenerys is technically a valid placement in Tivits terms, but I get the sense that it wasn't the placement that left her with the highest possible sum. Now, I know this analogy may seem to imply a certain objectivity that isn't entirely accurate to the situation, but I do understand that these values are subjective to each person's individual experience. Most of us just happen to have very similar experiences. I can get behind the show getting us to believe that her arc is about overcoming her family's past mistakes that long to corrupt her and then have her fail to overcome that as a sort of tragedy, but the way it happens, I'm not sold on it. First of all, within the actual scene, it's hard to tell what exactly it is that makes her snap. Is it the bells? The Red Keep? The prospect of Cersei? The scene doesn't visually clarify what exactly she's reacting to, and poor Emilia Clarke then had to fill in the gaps herself and try to convey this inner turmoil, but because of the lack of externalization, it doesn't get the message across. Second of all, it feels like with the most recent episodes, the show took a route that could have naturally curved in that direction and gotten there eventually, and just snapped it into the place they wanted it to go. That's the problem in general with these last 2 seasons. Rather than letting the story play out until it got to its natural destination, they decided on a destination and forced the story into it. Third of all, I guess the only feasible explanation is that Daenerys' arc is about mental illness. Because throughout the show she does all these noble things, claiming, this isn't how we do it, that's Cersei Lannister, not me. So we know deep down that this is her character, but it seems this mental illness as a result of Targaryen incest takes over, and I don't find that particularly compelling. Not that a narrative about struggling to overcome mental illness isn't compelling, but the way it's done here feels like a cop-out, because her arc has always been about overcoming familial behavior and expectations rather than familial illness. And to play this card at the end just feels cheap and disappointing. People act like her death in the finale was some sort of big twist, but I don't see what else could have happened to her after this episode, unless these people wanted the show to end with Daenerys as a successful tyrant. But I wouldn't even call this whole thing a twist, I just call it a bad narrative direction. Now I know this is Game of Thrones, and complex humans fighting each other is much more compelling than ice zombies, but the show has spent so much time building this up for winter, when the White Walkers will have peak power, and I guess I had hoped that they would pose more of a threat than just being a powerful army. Sure, they can only die from dragonglass or Valyrian steel, but when they're going against an army of people wielding basically all the dragonglass and Valyrian steel in the world, it's basically just an elevated man versus man fight. Also, if the reason dragonglass and Valyrian steel is effective against the White Walkers is because they were forged with dragon fire, why does dragon fire itself not do the trick? Anyway, that bothers me a little, along with some small things like the fact that this is supposed to be peak winter, which is supposed to be brutal, borderline uninhabitable weather, to the point where people warn about it for years, yet here in Winterfell, beacon of the north, snow is just casually melting as people casually stroll about. What's the point of hearing,
Winter is coming.
Winter is coming.
Winter is coming.
And winter is coming.
Winter is coming. Winter is coming.
Winter is coming.
Winter is coming.
Winter is coming. And winter is coming.
Drilled into our heads for years if it's gonna be this mild. Fargo does a better job conveying brutal winter than this show, and Westeros is supposed to be way more brutal than the American Midwest. What really bothers me, though, is the fact that all this time the show has been establishing these threads and tying them together into this singular coherent work, and I was always wondering how the White Walker stuff would tie into the throne stuff, especially when the conflicts actually started to be integrated with each other finally. And the answer is, it doesn't. It's like there were two separate shows going on, and one just grabbed the characters of the other for a little bit to finish up, before letting everyone go back into the other one to finish that one up. There are two entirely separate conflicts with little narrative connection, and a lot of potential to be thematically connected that the show doesn't take advantage of. I'm reminded of Tivits yet again. In the end, it gives us no reason for these two stories to be happening at the same time. And this also ties back into how bad the pacing was this season, because the first two episodes are building up to something entirely resolved in the next episode, and after that they're like, well, now that that's done, let's move on to the next thing to check off. I think the biggest consequence of all this shit, the biggest indicator that something's wrong, is that by the finale, I didn't care what happened anymore. I cared in episode 5 because of the baffling narrative decisions that were made, but by the end, I really couldn't care less. Bran winds up on the throne? Whatever. He's the three-eyed raven. Sure. Sansa's queen in the north? Great. This is the council? Fucking cool. Arya's a conquistador? Alright. I don't care that Jon didn't end up king. His heritage caused the tension that led Daenerys to snap, and while that arc is terrible, at least his being a Targaryen served a purpose, even if we didn't really feel much from it. Again, I don't see how Daenerys couldn't have died, but after all these seasons growing attached to her, she went out with a poof, with no other emotion. I know I'm not doing the best job explaining why exactly I stopped caring about all these things, but I think I just got so tired of all the poor decisions and lazy executions, I was just ready for it to be over. It was pretty strangely paced, but I don't even think the finale is the dumpster fire everyone's making it out to be. I think episode 5 is the big dumpster fire of the show, and while it maybe didn't do the best job wrapping things up, the finale was reasonable in a vacuum, and was really only bad because of the circumstances the rest of the season left it under. Overall, though, I think people have a right to be upset with all the loose ends that went absolutely nowhere. The quality of the show for the first 4 years and all the threads it set up gave us the impression that we were in store for an incredible knot-tying demonstration, and what we got was a bunch of 12-year-old Boy Scouts struggling to learn the clove hitch. I think back to the days where in a single episode we would have Jon Snow in the moral dilemma of killing a man to maintain his disguise as a wildling for the greater good of the Night's Watch, or spare his life to keep his oath at the cost of exposing himself to all these people who can kill him and to the love of his life, who is also in a dilemma because she loves him despite the lie the relationship was founded upon, as Jon's younger brother is A, in a tower next to him but unable to reveal himself, and B, discovering that he has the magical power to warg into other creatures because his friend is having an unstable breakdown that would expose them. And just a few minutes later, we would see a quarter of the cast, our good guys, killed off, slaughtered, as Arya puts the pieces together outside the scene. All this complexity in one episode. Now the kind of dilemma the show goes for is, do I kill this person who massacred thousands of innocent people because she's a tyrant, or spare her life because I apparently love her? Keep in mind, I'm leaving out the complex fact that she's his aunt and he's the rightful heir, because that fact is completely irrelevant to the scene, even though that card would have added a lot of complexity to it. Tivits, people. A lot of people stand by, sure, it's not what it used to be, but it's only bad by Game of Thrones standards and is still in the upper echelon of TV. And I would disagree with that. I think you could maybe make that case about Season 5, but Season 7 and 8 are just bad in their own right. They're just bad television. But then again, it is just television. It's provided us a lot over the years, and I am grateful for it. By no means do these final terrible seasons make me regret sitting through the first amazing seasons, but by analyzing these failures, we can further understand how to avoid them in the future. Also, I say all this using the hyperbolically morbid template of Massacre, but I know that I'm just some loser who watches the fruit of thousands of other people's hard work, and they owe me nothing. I say this merely hoping that someone will agree with me, and that my words can help someone make something better than they would have otherwise. At the end of the day, I'm sad that what my freshman self would have considered his favorite show plundered as much as it did, but there are more important things to be more sad about. And more importantly, there's so much other great art out there. If I'm sad that this show sucks now, I can just turn it off and watch something good, and then I will be happy. I recommend you all do the same, but not, of course, until after you follow me on Instagram and Twitter and Letterboxd and pledge to me on Patreon and worship me in any other way that you can, because I'm a power-hungry individual. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.